Hello BookTube, I'm Jonathan, and I like novels more than short stories. Or so I thought. You see, I've always been more drawn to novels, and that's why my bookshelf has over 200 sci-fi novels and only around 5 sci-fi short story collections. But recently, I've been thinking about how one of the strengths of the science fiction genre is the exploration of ideas. A short story can focus on a single concept without needing to flesh out the world building or the characters, so perhaps the short story is the perfect format for science fiction. So I decided to test out this theory by reading 2 of the most popular sci-fi short story collections, one modern, one classic, in order to see whether I should be adding more sci-fi short story collections to my bookshelf. And those 2 collections are Stories of Your Life and Others by Ted Chiang, and The Martian Chronicles by Ray Bradbury. Stories of Your Life and Others has 103,000 ratings on Goodreads with an average rating of 4.26. And The Martian Chronicles has 260,000 ratings with an average rating of 4.15. Now you might be thinking, but Jonathan, one of your short story collections is a novel. And yes, The Martian Chronicles is a fix-up novel, but Bradbury wrote and published all of the stories independently without the intention of it being a singular work. Only after the suggestion of a publisher did he stitch up all of the stories into a novel, and now having read it myself, I can say, at least to me, it feels more like a collection than it does a novel. So I'm going to review each of these 2 books and let you know whether they change my mind when it comes to the battle of novels versus short stories. Stories of Your Life and Others was kindly sent to me by a subscriber, HKT48man, so thank you very much for the kind gift, and this book is comprised of 8 stories, so I'm going to quickly go through them spoiler-free one by one, starting with Tower of Babylon. This story is Chiang's take on the legendary Tower of Babylon, constructed in order to reach heaven. Now for me, this was one of the weaker stories as I didn't overly connect to the characters or themes involved in building the tower. And so while I didn't necessarily love the journey, I was interested in getting to the destination, and luckily I feel like the story did deliver on that with an interesting ending. Next up was Understand, and I really like this story. It follows a man that is given an experimental drug in order to heal brain damage, and it has the side effect of increasing intelligence. It combines some of the themes of one of my favorite books, Flowers for Algernon, along with some cool technology, as well as the style and tone of a thriller. Of all the stories in this collection, this one had me turning the pages the fastest. The 3rd story is called Division by Zero, and this one broke my brain. The premise is that a mathematician proves that arithmetic is inconsistent. I understand that a lot of mathematics is theoretical, but the idea that we can't even agree that 1 + 1 = 2 made me irrationally upset. How upset exactly? I'd say at least the square root of 7. The 4th story in the collection is Stories of Your Life, which was the basis for the Denis Villeneuve film Arrival, which is one of my all-time favorite sci-fi films. I really enjoyed this story, but I think Arrival set the bar so high that I was just ever so marginally disappointed. I think everything to do with the first contact communication was brilliantly thought out, but for me it lacked some of the tension and the emotional weight of the film. The premise for the 5th story, 72 Letters, is that in an alternate history, science and technology are based on golems and the names embedded in them. It reminded me a little bit of the Darren Aronofsky film Pi, and while the premise did intrigue me intellectually, I don't think it really stuck with me emotionally. Moving on to the 6th story, we have The Evolution of Human Science, which is about humans and metahumans. As a fan of cyberpunk and transhumanism, I thought that this would be right up my alley, but in the end, I found this story to be somewhat forgettable. The penultimate story is titled Heaven is the Absence of God, and I think this might be one of the most polarizing stories. It takes place in a world where angels make appearances on Earth, but these visits aren't always benevolent, and often they result in collateral damage. I have to say, this story made me incredibly frustrated at times, even downright angry. But I have to say, I think a story that can elicit such a strong emotion is a successful story, even if it's not one that I overly enjoyed reading. And the final story is called Liking What You See, a documentary. In it, there are a series of interview transcripts, and they all revolve around a piece of technology called kaliagnosia, which produces an inability to recognize beauty or lack thereof in people's faces. I thought this story did such a good job of exploring all of the potential implications and perspectives on this particular technology. This story was actually nominated for a Hugo Award for the Best Novelette, but Chiang actually turned it down, stating that The story for him was rushed due to editorial pressure and didn't turn out the way he wanted. This actually ended up being my favorite story in the collection, so I guess that just goes to show how subjective reading is. And speaking of awards, this is a highly acclaimed collection of stories. The 8 stories in this book received a combined 9 nominations and 4 wins at the Hugo and Nebula Awards alone. For me, every story had a worthwhile premise, and while I enjoyed most of the stories in an intellectual or academic way, there were only a few which I was able to connect to emotionally or relate to personally. A common reaction I hear in regard to many short story collections is that they often contain a mix of hits and misses. For me, when it came to Stories of Your Life and Others, this was somewhat true, but for me, it didn't really swing between massive hits and huge misses. I thought most of the stories varied between pretty good and very good. Overall, I gave Stories of Your Life and Others a 7.5 out of 10. Okay, so now we move on to The Martian Chronicles by Ray Bradbury. It contains 26 stories, so buckle up. Just kidding, I'm just going to go through my thoughts on this overall as opposed to going through each story one by one. The first thing I noticed was the prose. Each sentence has a seamless flow to it, and the emotional moments land with a poetic impact. It really is just a pleasure to read throughout. The second thing that I noticed was it's quite funny. I wouldn't necessarily describe it as a sci-fi comedy, but Bradbury does a good job of finding humor in lost in translation interactions or in moments of juxtaposition where we have characters that'll be really riled up by something and then other characters that are just completely indifferent. It really added to my overall enjoyment of the reading experience. The Martian Chronicles is definitely on the softer end of the sci-fi spectrum. It doesn't adhere to strict science, and some of the logical leaps it makes are pretty large. Reading an Arthur C. Clarke book from a similar time period feels like a potentially accurate depiction of the future, whereas The Martian Chronicles feels a little bit more fantastical in its nature. But I still think it has the essence of science fiction, as the focus of the book is on the ideas. Each story has a clear idea or theme that came through clearly, and I personally resonated with many of them, whether it was exploring the future of humanity or just the nature of individual human relationships. I think I slightly preferred the first half of the novel, as towards the end it did feel like we were retreading over some of the same ideas. Also, the lesson of each story started to become a little bit more expositional, which I think might have worked better in a novel if the story had built up to that moment, whereas in individual stories, it didn't quite feel as organic or earned. It would be interesting to see the changes between the original stories and the final novel, as I know that Bradbury did do some rewriting in order to try and connect some of the stories together. There was one funny moment where Bradbury brings back a character, and I thought to myself that it didn't really feel like the original character. And then moments later, we have someone saying how their behavior was so typical for that particular original character. And it kind of just felt like Bradbury was trying to convince us that that was true. So I sort of had to laugh because it was kind of like me saying, this doesn't feel at all like Steve. And then a moment later, somebody else is like, ha, classic Steve. I think if you're a fan of some classic writers, including Edgar Rice Burroughs or Edgar Allan Poe, there'll be some interesting references for you to pick up on and enjoy. Bradbury is clearly such a fan of literature itself, and that really comes through in the book. There's even a story that contains some nods to some themes that he will explore later on in his novel Fahrenheit 451. Overall, this was a very pleasant read with some great high points. It didn't quite build to something that would make me put it amongst my all-time favorites, but I very much enjoyed reading it, and I gave it an 8 out of 10. So, have these collections changed my mind when it comes to the question of novels versus short stories? While I did enjoy them and I do plan on reading more short story collections, I think they actually confirmed why I prefer novels. Firstly, it's hard to view them as singular works of art. For example, when it came to Stories of Your Life and Others, I didn't find any connecting themes or concepts that made the stories work better as a collection. You could just read one story and then stop, or 2 stories and then stop, whatever you like. And so for that reason, I think that the collection was the sum of its parts, rather than something that was greater than the sum of its parts. A novel, on the other hand, is often greater than the sum of its parts. In a short story collection, a story that you don't really connect with doesn't have much secondary value, whereas in a novel, a chapter that you don't really connect with can still end up paying off later in the book. Individually, it might not add that much entertainment value, but it adds value to the larger piece of work. I think of it like cooking. I don't really like the taste of apple cider vinegar by itself, but you throw that in there on a glaze while cooking up some chicken, now we're talking. The second reason why I prefer novels to short stories is that, while I think you can effectively explore concepts in short stories, which appeals to me as an ideas-driven sci-fi reader, I think you can do so just as effectively in novels. In something like The Dark Forest by Cixin Liu or House of Suns by Alistair Reynolds, those books explore a ton of different sci-fi concepts, and it's not jarring when we move from concept to concept because they're connected by the same story, the same world, and the same characters. Whereas in a short story collection, we can effectively explore sci-fi concepts, but it is a little bit more jarring when we move from concept to concept because we get introduced to a new world, a new story, and new characters. For me, there isn't an upside to the short story that outweighs the downsides. The downside being that it is forced to explore science fiction through width rather than through depth. There just isn't enough time in order to develop the world, the thematic explorations, or develop the characters. One advantage of the short story is that it has to be tight. They don't suffer from the bloat that a lot of modern novels do. As they say, familiarity breeds contempt. But familiarity also breeds fondness. While I do think it is possible to form an emotional connection with a short story, I don't think it's possible to develop as deep an emotional connection as you can with a longer novel. While many novels do overstay their welcome, I think that the potential heights of the story, when executed correctly, is higher with a novel. So there you go, I enjoyed these collections and I do plan to read more short stories. But at the end of the day, I'm still team novel. Let me know which team you're on in the comments. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, smash or just gently click the subscribe button. And if you really enjoyed it, consider checking out the perks of becoming a Patreon member, where you can become one of my robots, androids, or cyborgs like Nima and New Eden, Half Ogre, Zakaway, and the novel Colin. And you can find more sci-fi content over here.